Hello, welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar. I'm Ian Welsh and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. In the next hour, we are going to be discussing and assessing the challenges in implementing successful reuse approaches that are sustainable, profitable and scalable. And we'll highlight what's needed to ensure schemes work in practice and really deliver for consumers and for business in reality. So we have an excellent panel. I'm delighted to be joined by Rosie Sharp, who's creative partner for plastics and packaging at Hubbub, Eline Leising, Program Manager at Enviu, and Jolanda de Rooij, Senior Global Sustainability Manager, Circular Economy at Unilever. Welcome to you all. I will turn to our panel shortly, but we do want to hear from you. Please do be thinking about your points and questions that you'd like me to put to our panel and use the Q&A box on your Zoom window to deliver those. You can, of course, like others' questions, and the more likes a question gets, the greater the chance that I will put that question to the panel. Questions can be to everybody or to individual panelists specifically. We are recording the session and we will share video and audio after the event. Okay, let's go. Jolanda, welcome. Why don't you start by outlining the challenges that you found in developing reuse and refill models? What's worked and what you've learned from pilots and other projects. Jolanda.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ian, and great to be here as part of this panel. As Unilever, from 2018 on, we really took a test and learn approach when it comes to reuse. So from 2018 until now, we have done around 50 pilots on reuse and refill, trialing different models in different categories in different markets, really to test and learn, as I mentioned, and then to understand which models can scale. I think what we see is that the refill at home model is the one that is most scalable at the moment. I think most of you will know what this is, that you will have your keeper pack and then you will have your refill pack, and then consumers can take it home and they can refill it at home. It's very close to what consumers are used to now, so there you see that it is scalable. We had some really good results, for example, with the Omo dilute model, where you have like a concentrate and then at home consumers add water, which is also saving, let's say, transportation costs and water costs, etc. There is still a challenge in terms of consumer uptake, even with these models that we see. It's not that we can just scale it everywhere. There is still that challenge of, for example, being then the only solution in a shelf, and that is still causing, let's say, issues for consumer then to switch to those models. The other model we tested is then the refill in-store model. Here we had some more challenges, primarily because of it's quite a different way for consumers to shop. They have to bring their own bottles, or they can use a bottle that we could provide to them as well. But you see that a lot of consumers, they prefer to just use their own bottles. But that is a whole different way of shopping. And with the systems at the time that we tested, there was also quite some risks of spillage, and also retailers were not always that fan of it, because it's, again, you have to reserve a complete section in the supermarket for it. So it's a complete change in the retail section. We did see that these type of models work better in the global south or in the lower income countries, like in Africa where we tested this, or in India and in Indonesia. But I'm sure Eline can tell much more about this. But we see some more successful results there. And for us, that was also a learning that what works in one country or in one region, it doesn't mean that it can work in the other region. It's very much dependent on existing consumer behavior, but also on, let's say, the culture in the country. And then maybe then just to close, the final model that we tested was the return models, either that people just buy a pre-filled bottle off the shelf, which is not a big change from what they are doing today, but the only thing they have to remember is that they bring the empty bottle back, and then the whole cleaning and sorting process is done in the back end via a third-party provider, or whatever we choose there. This was more successful because, as I already highlighted before, we've learned that for a consumer to embrace reuse, it has to be convenient. And I think the return model really showed us that as consumers still shop in the same way, and only bringing back the bottle is something you can teach a consumer much easier than, for example, having to do it with a whole dispenser, etc., like the refill in store. But still, the challenge is then on the cost side, because we have done this to date only with, let's say, our brands. And we do see that does not allow us to reach the level of scale to make the model cost effective. So there we have a big challenge in terms of, yeah, how can we make it also attractive in cost? Because that is the other learning we got, is that consumers, they don't just switch to reuse just because of sustainability. They would really want, let's say, this extra benefit of convenience, of cost. And that is something that currently the return models that we trialed, although we see it from a theoretical modeling that it is possible to make it economically viable, but that we haven't been able to achieve that because of, yeah, not the right amount of volumes. And that's also why we've one of the things we're looking to do now is going into these pre-competitive collaborations, because we really think that by working together across the value chain, we will be able to achieve this level of scale and then making the models economically viable. But that is what, let's say, where we are right now, getting into these collaborations across the value chain to then be able to prove that reuse can work at scale.
Thanks very much. Interesting point you made around being the only brand on the shelf that's doing this. So I guess here there really isn't pioneer advantage.
At this moment, I think, especially with those models, and since it is such a big consumer change you're asking consumers to do, that indeed you need to be not, let's say, the only thing on the shelf, because it is just such a change for consumers that they still tend to then prefer convenience over, let's say, a little bit less convenience, which in honesty, some of the reuse models are, of course. So yeah, I think it is difficult indeed to get a pre-competitive advantage here. And that this does require a pre-competitive collaboration instead.
Yeah, and thank you. On the refill model, or the return model rather, that you mentioned, I guess that's a situation where glass is viable, because the problem with glass, of course, it's heavy, but it does fit well into a return model in that it can be, a glass bottle that's intact, can of course be reused many times. It's easy to sterilize and everything else. So is that a kind of model where glass can be part of the mix?
I think it can be. I think that not only, of course, for this model, but I think the return model is actually most convenient for it. There is just one thing, like for our product portfolio, like for example, shampoo or body wash, like products that you would use in a shower or where there is like slippery ground, then glass can still not be the right solution. And I think that is also what the learnings that we got, that reuse, it can differ for any product. You can have you may need a different approach. That, like, for example, glass would not work well with shampoo bottles. Paper would also not work necessarily well with like liquid products, for example. So it's really like for each product category, it could mean that you just need to tailor it the way you then propose the reuse model.
And for the return model, what sort of level of deposit has to be in place for it to work?
Yeah, we actually tested with different because it's again dependent on the country you're in, because some countries, it's in the culture, let's say, like I can speak for the Netherlands, for example, that we like deposits. We are used to it. And then for us, even if it's just a really small deposit, Dutch people would still bring it back. But that can be different, for example, in the UK, where we saw we actually needed quite a significant deposit for consumers to return it. And that's again then different around the world, where in some countries you could say we don't need a deposit, and then reward systems, for example, with couponing or something like that could already work. So again, it's very tailored to, let's say, the country and the culture you're working with. To be able to say this is the right amount of deposit that you should put.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for setting the scene, and lots there that we can come back to. And thank you also for our brave first questioners. Thank you very much for putting your questions in the Q&A box. We'll come to those a little bit later. Please do put your name. Be great if you could put your name, then we can get some context for your comments. But thanks very much indeed for those. So, Rosie, let me turn to you. Perhaps you can move the conversation forward a little bit by talking about some of the lessons learned from your projects in the UK. Rosie.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me here, Ian. And perhaps just following on some of the points that Jolanda was just talking about around deposits. So Hubbub were an environmental charity. We work with lots of brands and businesses and focus on communication campaigns and behavior change techniques to encourage action that's good for the environment. We also do quite a bit of grant funding. So last year we ran the Bring It Back Fund, which was a £1 million fund with funding from Starbucks that we put towards a range of different reusable packaging projects across the UK. So this was really interesting to get insights from projects that used sort of similar models but tweaked slightly different things and were like in geographically different areas across the UK. So just on that point about sort of deposits and whether you need one or not, there were 2 different projects that didn't have any deposits. So one of them was a trial between a startup called Again, who trialed with Uber Eats, the online delivery takeaway app. And the thinking was here that it would be really convenient to deliver reusable packaging to people for their takeaways and then collect it from their doorstep, and presuming that that home delivery and collection model would make it very convenient and therefore not need a deposit for people to borrow the returnable packaging from the takeaway provider. But this saw really low return rates. Even though that sounds convenient, there was still an extra step in that process to actually book a return. You had to scan a QR code and book a return for your packaging to be collected by Again. So although it's coming from your house, there was still really low return rates. There was a £10 incentive that was trialled to try and increase those return rates. They did double, but they still only got up to 20% return rate. There was another element there of the packaging looking very similar to the single-use alternative. So in the UK, you get sort of takeaways delivered in sort of clear plastic containers, and the reusable version looked really similar to this as well. So I think having more differentiated packaging between single-use and reuse could perhaps lead to higher return rates, but that's where perhaps a deposit or a charge for returning would have still been useful despite having that home collection. But to contrast that to a different trial, another one was with Mercato Metropolitano, which is a street food market in Elephant and Castle in London that has over 40 food vendors. 90% of those switched to returnable packaging. And there was also no deposit here, and this was more of a closed loop setting, saw a much higher return rate of around 70%. They saved over 190,000 pieces of single-use packaging in 7 months. And one bit that I think is really interesting with that trial is that the vendors saved over £50,000 in packaging costs. So starting to get to that point where you see the sort of financial viability as well as environmental viability of having a decent return rate by having no deposit and being in a closed loop location, making it very convenient to return the packaging, and operationally viable as well for the vendors who really used the packaging in much the same way and had on-site washing facilities. So I think that's sort of a nice combination of those 3 things of operational, financial, and environmental viability. Similarly, some other trials that Hubbub has done ourselves. We've previously done more work with Starbucks where we have trialled a returnable cup system in Canary Wharf at 5 of their cafes. Before that, we also did a trial at Gatwick Airport with the Starbucks that was there. So again, Gatwick Airport's a closed loop location, which a lot of people presume is like the perfect solution for reuse. But there were lots of challenges encountered there. It wasn't there wasn't as much operational buy-in. It didn't fit with the usual sort of operational systems that they had there in terms of cleaning teams and logistics, which meant that the system just didn't run very smoothly, and that impacted the return rate. And also with it just being one outlet at the airport that was running the scheme made it hard to get sort of scale and convenience, even though it is within a closed loop location. We found it would have been a lot more effective if all sort of participating vendors were on board and the scheme could have had greater scale across that closed loop location. So in Canary Wharf, we increased that to 5 cafes within the region of Starbucks that were taking part. And we saw that worked really well for regular customers. So Canary Wharf is, a big business area in London. There were lots of regular commuters who really bought into the scheme and just kept coming back to refill their cup with a new drink. So we found the scheme worked really well there. As well as in drive-throughs was an interesting discovery from that trial. I think because people can store their cup in the car, that led to it being really convenient for them to just hand the cup over and get that refilled. There's no issues of carrying or storing a reusable cup. But still, it was only one retailer, and to Jolanda's point of having that sort of collaboration to help scale, it was still limited and sort of trapped in that confines of a small trial and not reaching those points of that tipping point and the viability in terms of environmental, operational, financial viability. So sort of with all those learnings from our own trials with Starbucks and others through the Bring It Back Fund, we are now embarking on our own collaborative returnable cup system that we'll be launching in Glasgow in the next 1 to 2 months, where we'll be launching with over 30 participating locations, 3 different major brands taking part, along with independent cafes, to really put this to the test and find out how a collaborative system can help reach those tipping points. Other issues that we've found through doing research. So we released a report called the Bring It Back Fund, where we spoke to over 40 different organisations in the UK to get their experience with reuse and refill systems. And we found there issues with user journeys. So having any apps or sign-up processes can really deter people from taking part. That was another thing we found in one of the Bring It Back Fund projects in the Scottish Highlands. It was a returnable cup scheme, but there was an app that you had to download to take part, which meant there was very low uptake, although a really high return rate. So it's all about finding that balance between, not adding in too many barriers that people won't take part, but having enough mechanisms in there to get people to return the packaging. So we're aiming for Borrow Cup, the collaborative scheme in Glasgow, to be a very simple user journey, one brand, sort of cohesive and consistent cup branding messaging across all the participating locations to try get that convenience and scale that's needed to boost uptake and return rates and make these reuse schemes viable. TBC, we will see how it goes.
So in Glasgow then, you see there are a number of different vendors are collaborating. Does that mean then that there's a standard cup, so there's no marketing messages, no branding on the cups?
Yes, so we've created sort of a standalone brand called Borrow Cup that all the participating chains will be using. Firstly, that makes it easier for the consumer that no matter where they go, they're going to see the same brand, the same message, the same steps and communications. So that should make it a lot easier for them. Also, in terms of desirability of the packaging, we're purposefully going for a brand and a design that isn't that nice. It's not going to be the nicest cup you've ever seen or the best branding you've ever seen, because we find that if you make it really nice, people will want to hang on to those cups and we want them to return them. And hopefully by using the Borrow Cup brand, it means that if you're a big fan of one of the participating brands, if the cup was in their branding, you would probably be more likely to keep it as well. So we're hoping that will lead to higher return rates by going for slightly ugly cups.
I like that. A really sort of reverse incentive, isn't it? Make them just so they're functional, but nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, thanks, Sue. Again, lots to come back on there, but thanks very much, Rosie. Eline, welcome. Thanks for your patience. Perhaps you can similarly give us some of the things that you've learned from your projects in Indonesia. I know you've been working over there, and elsewhere. And how does it chime with the sort of with Rosie's experience in the UK?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Ian, and great to be here. So I'm indeed Eline, the program manager for Enviu in Indonesia. And Enviu is an impact-driven venture building studio. We build businesses that serve both people and planet, and we focus our efforts on specific themes in geographical regions. And in Southeast Asia and currently in Indonesia, we're working on plastics. We started this plastics program in 2019. And so far, we've been working on 7 businesses that all prevent single-use plastics packaging usage, and mainly via reuse and refill models. And 2 of our current ventures are, for instance, Alas and Alnar. Alnar provides a wide variety of daily necessities in returnable packaging, thereby replacing, for instance, sachets, pouches, and other flexible packaging from being used. And Alas focuses on the F&B market and offers reusable cups, containers, plates, and cutlery. So I think quite some of Rosie's examples also refer to that. So we also try that in Indonesia. We're also part of the Asia Reuse Consortium, and we are also exchanging with other reuse and refill pilots internationally in the global north, but also actually mainly in the global south. So I will share a bit of what we learned in a completely different setting than the UK-based ones or the Dutch ones we've heard so far. And I will go over three main models and what we learned, what works and doesn't work in like Indonesia Global South context. And the first one is the returnable packaging system, or like the pre-fill system. So this is, for instance, what we apply with our venture Alnar. And here we see that there is consumer adoption. It's proven because the business is growing and growing, because it's actually very simple. You just swap the packaging when you finalize the product. So this can be done in our models, both at your doorstep or as we do that via e-commerce. And we're also present in reselling communities, which are close to people's houses anyway. So it's not a big hassle in bringing all kinds of containers to large retail outlets. So we really see that helps in this model. And what also helps here is affordability, because indeed it's been mentioned, sustainability is not the only reason. And especially I think in the global south, it's not the reason to switch to these models. It has to be price competitive. But by partnering directly with FMCG brands, like also Unilever, Alnar can provide competitive prices, making reuse as affordable and attractive as single use. And we apply what we call a cashback system. It's basically the deposit return system, but then phrased differently, because that is how Indonesians, they don't like to pay upfront, but if they get the cashback eventually and initially pay more, then it's okay. So that's what we apply to incentivize the returns. And then in the long run, like after like 1, 2, 3 returns, they only pay for the content, so they actually save on their purchases. And what also works really well in this model is that we apply like a community-based model, so the uptake really goes via these communities. And this is not for the e-commerce part of the model, but for the offline channels, as we call it. And there we would work with communities of housewives linked to local waste banks and small shops. They're called warungs in Indonesia. And they're basically our resellers, and we split the margin on the system with them. And that also means that there's an incentive for them to become resellers, so they can actually earn around 10 to 50% on average more by reselling the returnable packaging systems. So this is the first model where, like I said, we're expanding because it works. Secondly, the refills. Jolanda also talked about it. There we've been piloting and trialing as well. And our main conclusion is that the machine refills, so like the technology-based ones in retail, what we've also done in apartment buildings, they don't really work at least in Indonesia and like the more global south setting. With the exception actually of drinking water, that works there. You see like these machines where you can quickly fill your bottle. But for FMCG products, we think it won't be the way to go because customers, they like the customer journey to be as simple as possible. And with the machine, they actually like to be assisted. So but that then directly actually eliminates the need for the expensive machine. So that one doesn't really work. And what is related a bit to refills is the bulk stores. They're also present actually in Indonesia and the Global South. But we also see that that is, yeah, they started, but they're also already in decline. So we also don't think that is going to be mainstream because, yeah, this is quite a hassle. Then you need to bring your own container, and you're not doing that for all your daily groceries. So that's also not going to work. But what we see for refill that can work, and that is happening all over the Global South actually, is in the traditional trade setting. So that's these small, like mom and pop stores that are close to consumers anyways, where they sell all kinds of products or even coffees, etc. 70% of the whole Indonesian FMCG market is anyways sold via these traditional trade markets. So it is a big one. And there it has to be very easy and low tech. So no machines, just like refilling. Yeah, we're doing a project actually with Unilever on this, but we've seen various options. So from like either like dispensing machines to just from large bulky containers in smaller ones. And this works, especially if it's non-food products, because that is like hygiene-wise a bit of an issue. But non-food works, and it also works with people bringing their own containers because it is close to people's houses, and they don't need to bring all kinds of containers from far. So that's on the refill, and the final one that links to Rosie's experiences on the F&B market, so the reusable and returnable meal containers and cups. There we see that there is some demand, but it's very niche, and due to that, the fact that it's niche, we have been able to get very high return rates, like 93% with our pilot. So that is great. But we also see that this really needs to be driven by policies. That's actually also what's happening now in Europe, Global North, and in the US. I think there's also some large scale pilots on this, and that really helps. But these policies are not yet present in Southeast Asia or in the Global South in general. So this really needs to be policy driven to make it happen.
Very much indeed. So what are you then, as an organization, using from what you've discussed in Indonesia? How are you using the lessons learned there to develop projects elsewhere?
Yeah, good question. We're currently not very actively expanding yet, but we are mainly actually also looking at setting up consortia to align also what is happening, what other organizations are doing, because we're not the only ones, especially if you look at the whole Global South market. There's much more going on. So yeah, our aim is now also to align all these innovators and to set up the consortia with, for instance, the industry players like the FMCG partners, because like Jolanda said, you need this pre-competitive collaboration, large scale setup to really scale up reuse and refill businesses from only pilots to really being more mainstream.
Okay, thanks very much. Jolanda, I wonder if I can come back to you. Perhaps you could reflect on the examples shared by Rosie and Eline, and how do they compare and chime with your experience at Unilever?
Yeah, I think actually, to me, it's like it also further emphasizes what let's say what we are looking to do now as a next step. That this collaboration is key, and for me also then the whole systems thinking, because this is not something you say, well, we would do this together with a group of brands, and it's not only that, it's also thinking about how would you design such a system in a specific country, because it's as we have seen from the examples, I think it can be very different from one country to another, how people perceive reuse and how they would like to see it. So you need to understand these differences, and it's just really important, like for the return models, that you come to standards in, for example, washing standards or in design standards for your products, cleaning standards, because you want to reach that level of scale. So you want to make sure that there is enough sort of standardization and support there to be able to do that. And I think what's been very telling for me is one of the reports that came out last year, which was raised by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation about how you can scale returnable packaging. And these things came up again, that this does require a shared infrastructure for then the washing or for installing the refill machines. I think it applies for all the models actually. And that you need indeed a high enough level of scale to not only make it an environmentally viable solution to single use, but also an economically viable. And I think, again, the three examples of the three of us show that sustainability benefit is not enough. People don't switch because they know this is an environmental benefit, but they would also like to see this cost and convenience benefit. And I think that is what we need to crack, let's say, to be able to scale reuse.
And how do you get around the challenge that Rosie highlighted in her example in Glasgow of different branded vendors using a standard cup? Because so many, I mean, I'm thinking of Starbucks, for example, and many other coffee brands, you know, very distinctive branding. So how do you think, or how do you get around that conversation internally? The sort of, well, you know, you're going to have to accept that you're not going to have that nice branding anymore, potentially.
Yeah. For me, I think it's not like the level of differentiation there. Sorry, the level of standardization can be very different. You can look to, let's say, the right end, let's say, of standardization, where it's all completely the same bottles. And yeah, from a marketing point of view, from a brand differentiation point of view, that is not, let's say, the way you want it. And on the other hand, you have then completely different bottles, different shapes. And I think it will already like standardization can also be in the middle of that you say, well, we standardize it to some level, that indeed the washing and the cleaning is optimized, but that brands could still, via labeling or via a different cap, for example, a different color, they could still distinguish their brand. Because indeed, for branded companies, it is important to be able to differentiate themselves. But it doesn't mean that you can still optimize it for a system. So yeah, I definitely see still opportunity. For me, reusable packaging does not necessarily mean there is no brand differentiation possible anymore.
Okay, thanks very much. And thank you also to our listeners who have put some questions into the Q&A box. I can guarantee at this stage, if you do a question now, we will get it asked, I promise. And particular thanks to Joe Hendricks for 3 questions already. So thanks very much to you. Okay, let's turn to some of these questions now. First question, Joe Hendricks asks, what is the volume required in terms of citizen engagement to make a reuse return model viable as a percentage? Do you have any thoughts on any of that? Who'd like to answer? Jolanda, do you have any thoughts on that in particular? So what level of engagement is required for it to work?
I don't have that information. I don't think we've looked at that to see, like, because we've, like I said, up until now, we've been trialing just with our products. But one of the learnings was for us that it needs to be, let's say, a significant, and that's why we're looking for this collaboration, that you need to have a significant amount of the shelf to be able to have consumers, let's say, switch. Because if they don't have a choice, then yeah, consumers still want to get, let's say, their favorite flavor or their favorite fragrance. They still want to buy that. And if you're only offering 1 or 2 variants in a reusable packaging, then a consumer will still, they won't necessarily buy that. So for me, it does mean that if you're switching, then you need to do it at large, at scale. But I can't give an exact percentage. Not sure if Eline or Rosie have any, but I wouldn't be able to give an exact percentage on this.
Rosie, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I mean, you mentioned percentages in your opening remarks. What level of engagement is required?
Yeah, so for the Borrow Cup project in Glasgow, we're aiming between a 10 to 20% uptake rate. So sort of every, 1 or 2 in 10 coffees, drinks being sold in a returnable cup as a starting point. I think there's a few barriers in terms of a busy coffee shop and the amount of time that a barista needs to spend promoting and explaining the scheme that are going to limit sort of how much uptake we will have. And it's, I guess we're aiming to start with sort of the audience that are engaged, they're a regular customer, so they're most likely to use the scheme, and also reasonably environmentally motivated to take part in the scheme and sort of, yeah, go out of their way to try something slightly different. So that's why we're looking at around 10 to 20% uptake rate at first. But I think really in terms of it becoming financially viable, that is going to be driven by the uptake. And we've seen that in the modelling for this scheme that yeah, it only gets to financial viability the more and more people are using it. So definitely, it obviously depends on the costs of running and implementing whatever scheme you're doing. But that's, yeah, I think that's the key to achieving the financial viability piece.
When you say uptake, do you mean in terms of vendor uptake or consumer uptake?
Consumer uptake, that is, yeah.
So you're only expecting 2 out of 10 to be returned. So do the vendors exclusively use this cup, or can they still have their own branded cup?
Yeah, 1 to 2 out of 10 to be of sales to be taken in a reusable cup.
Okay.
So they're still offering single use. Would be great if we can test any environments where there's only the returnable cup. To test that perhaps in a closed loop space like a cinema or something could be a good option. But yeah, uptake in terms of percentage of customers that are buying their drink in a reusable cup.
And of that 20%, how many do you expect to get back?
We're hoping to get, I would say around, we're still doing life cycle analysis to find out what that needs to be to reach the break-even point of it being better for the environment. But we're hoping to be at least absolute minimum 70-75%, hopefully more towards 80-85%. But yeah, conducting the life cycle analysis to know what that needs to be for it to be better than single-use cups.
Great, thank you. Eline, over to you. So what have you found from your work, the kind of level of engagement that makes it viable?
Yeah, so first of all, perhaps good to note that Alnar is actually already viable as we're talking financial viability. So they're making revenues. They're not yet break even, but hopefully next year that will happen. So I think it also it's related to multiple things. Partly the model, like the returnable, like pre-fill packaging model, is in a way financially the more the better model, I would say, from our learnings, because you can actually schedule the returns and make that more efficient. So with our reuse communities that sell the returnable packaging, they also collect it back, but we don't need to be there directly, and that's different with the food and beverage market. And you consume it right away, and then it has to go back somewhere. Closed loop is easier, but open loop is very difficult there. So in that sense, that is one part of the model that makes it financially more interesting. And I can imagine like that, at least that is what we're also currently why we think we should really promote also Global South for reuse and refill. Operational costs are a big part, and that's usually in Global North quite a challenge, but in the Global South it is just cheaper, honestly, to apply these models because labor costs are lower, and you have a lot of those. So our main costs on the capex end are mainly the washing facilities, some like logistics costs, and at the moment the containers ourselves, so we own them now. Eventually scaling up, we might not even want to do that, but then it means the rest is all operational costs. And that is just, you can do that quite efficiently in a more, Global South context. So that's first. And for indeed, like the F&B market, the returnable cups, plates, etc., we're also still struggling to make that financially viable. The exact percentages, I don't know, but indeed, that's why we're currently focusing on these closed loop environments. Like Rosie said, indeed, if you have an event, a cinema, a mall, whatever, it's easier. You can keep them there, all the returnables, and ideally also wash them locally.
Okay, thank you. Jolanda, a slightly different question, just another question from our audience. For Unilever, what's the level of economic viability in terms of these sort of schemes is required for one that would get a green light? I mean, does it have to wash its face? Are you prepared to take a kind of initial loss? Or what's the sort of economics that works for you?
Yeah, I think the pilots we did, they all started, let's say, not at a because you need to set up the whole system. So our pilots actually they were at that point at a loss, but we did it indeed for the test and the learn and to get an understanding of what it would mean that if we could get it at scale, it could become profitable. And I think that is what our pilots have indeed showed, that even though in the pilot phase they are still uneconomical. But the modeling we did, if we could expand it to an X number of store, or if we could expand it, let's say, to a larger product range, then it could become economically viable. So the modeling is there. And it is, definitely, let's say, a decision point in whether we would put a product on the market in returnable packaging, yes or no. Because ideally, indeed, it is more, we can bring it to market, let's say, cheaper than single use, because we know that is one of the things that would convince consumers to then switch. Like I think Eline also mentioned that already, that it has to be ideally lower priced. So for us it is the idea to indeed make it competitive to single use, and that's why it needs to be at least at the same price. And we have indeed also theoretical proof that it could work by the modeling we did. We just want to move now into, let's say, demonstrating this in practice by indeed doing these collaborations on reuse to indeed show that at a certain level of scale, these models will become economically viable. And we then sort of want to prove the theory that this is happening at scale.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Great question from one of our audience, referring back to, I think it was something that you mentioned, Jolanda, the fact that reuse models are doing better in the global south compared to perhaps more developed markets. Our questioner asks, is it just because consumers are spoiled, or is there not enough economic benefit? What's your thoughts on that? And I like everyone's thoughts on that, but Jolanda, your thoughts on that? I mean, you mentioned it.
Yeah, well, I think also Eline answered it already a bit, that it's really in like, if you would look in the global south, like those mom and pop stores that Eline mentioned, it's more in the culture of indeed going frequently to the shop, and then just like it's small distances, it's easy for people, it's still convenient. So that's why they like it and they are more inclined to use it. While here in, let's say, the global north, then it's really, we're so used to, let's say, going to the shop and just taking our packaging and not having to think about that we have to take things back or that we have to take things from home. That is really, I think, a cultural difference, and not necessarily, I would not call it necessarily spoiled, but really like, how we are used to doing shopping, and then changing that behavior is a bit more difficult than where it's already more into the culture of, bringing your own stuff and refilling your products. But happy to hear, Eline, what you think.
Yeah, Eline.
No, I completely agree, and perhaps even on top of that, like in the Western countries, single-use plastics have been introduced, I think, from the 60s or 70s or so, like quite a while ago, and it's now so mainstream. And actually, the really widespread single-use plastics packaging in Asia and Africa that only started like 10-20 years ago. It's not that long ago when a lot of the industry players discovered actually the back then the bottom of the pyramid market. So before that, people were just used to using banana leaves for their packaging, bringing everything themselves if they were doing grocery shopping on the market, for lunch, always their own lunchbox, those kind of things. So it's more in the culture still, because it's not been that long ago that all these single-use plastics were introduced.
Yeah, just to add a slightly separate point to that as well, I think, especially in the UK, but other countries in the global north, I think sort of our waste management systems, and we get doorstep collections for your rubbish and recycling, and there's been so much focus and education in the UK on increasing recycling, that has become the norm and the priority. So getting people to then sort of change out of those behaviors and do something like reuse, where you have to go take your own packaging to the supermarket or return something outside of your house, makes it feel a lot more inconvenient than perhaps other countries that might not be used to that level of convenience in terms of recycling and waste management from their doorstep.
Rosie, just to follow on from that, again, a question that's been put to us. What do you see in terms of reuse models becoming being legislated in the UK? A bit like sometimes, as I understand it, they are in France. Is that something that you think is going to be on the horizon?
Hopefully in future. I think because there has been so much focus on legislation around recycling with simpler recycling and trying to get DRS set up in the UK, that reuse has definitely been on the back burner. We have heard murmurings that it's now becoming more of a priority, and I think we're hoping that projects like the Borrow Cup scheme in Glasgow will sort of be a great case study to show to government of what these schemes could look like and how they can scale, and how something like DRS, where we're getting people to do the hard part of returning their packaging to a store, to a DRS return point. So if we're getting them to do the hard part, then could we just be reusing that packaging rather than recycling it? So I think there's definitely opportunities there. There's also been previous talk of a latte levy, a tax or a charge on single-use cups. I'm not sure how realistic that is to come in anytime soon, but something like that would be excellent in terms of putting those funds towards funding reuse systems and sort of those extra infrastructure costs that make them financially difficult to set up and get off the ground, that perhaps sort of other taxes and charges on single-use packaging could be funneled into funding viable, convenient reuse alternatives.
I wonder, given that in the UK context, we've all got used to having to pay for plastic bags in stores, it's not that much of a leap to move to a single-use cup. So perhaps maybe, who knows, it may just an observation. Jolanda, I wondered from your perspective, what does good policy look like?
Good policy on reuse, you mean then, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, for at least for Unilever, we are also part of the like currently the negotiations for the plastics treaty are ongoing, and I think there, as part of the business coalition, we are also asking for these reuse provisions. I think for us, indeed, to be able to scale reuse, we would need supportive policy as well, because I think the challenge of competing with single use is real, and the more we can get, let's say, what we would call a level playing field for all companies, then it would be easier to indeed scale some of the voluntary actions we are already taking. What is also very important, and it wasn't really raised yet, let's say, in this panel, is that especially for companies that are working internationally, it's also very important to get, let's say, these global guidelines or global standards on reuse. So understanding like what are the design requirements, for example, like what does a returnable packaging need to look like, because that it could work into indeed a system for collection and a system for cleaning, so that you agree design standards, but also, as I mentioned, washing standards or cleaning standards, to make it easier for companies like us, like Unilever, to scale it internationally. But also understanding like how can we measure it and how can we measure progress, because I think what no one wants is that if you would put, for example, a target and say like you have to put an X amount of returnable packaging on the market, but if there is no system for collection, or there is no opportunity for, or consumers are just not bringing it back, then you could even, let's say, aggravate the situation. So what you would want is, again, this sort of systems thinking, and having also governments or cities involved in some of these reuse pilots to really think about, but how can we also make sure that the packaging is not only returnable by design, but that there is also then a collection and an infrastructure available to be able to collect the bottle that needs to get returned, and that for consumers it's convenient that they don't only have to go to the shop, for example, to return their bottle, but that they can also return it on the curbside, or that they can, if they go, for example, to drop off their kids at school, that they can also drop off a bottle there. So I think what for us is key is that we think about, okay, how are we going to design systems, such a system, through collaborating across the entire value chain to really understand then, how we can, how to scale the reuse and make it as convenient as possible for the consumers.
Thank you. Rosie, I want to come back to you. A quick question. The questioner, it's Joe Hendricks, asking the vendors at your Elephant and Castle project, and I guess it might be relevant for your one in Glasgow. How do you get everyone to collaborate? What's the incentive? You know, how do you get everyone on board? Because I guess it only works if everyone's on board.
Yeah, so in the Elephant and Castle situation, there were a lot of concerns over things like space. How much more space is the reusable packaging going to take up compared to single use? I think, to be honest, a big win was the fact that it was a grant-funded project, so there was no costs for them in sort of purchasing the reusable packaging, which meant that sort of those savings in single-use packaging were so big because the independent businesses weren't the ones that were having to purchase the packaging. And in terms of the question, I think it was about sort of getting people to return the packaging. So there were sort of communal bins around the food market, and the packaging was standardized. So there was just plates and bowls that all of the vendors used. And then over time, you know, when they saw the savings in single-use packaging costs and the fact that people were returning the packaging, more and more vendors came on board, and just, yeah, the success of the scheme proved itself.
Okay, thank you. Another question, talking about terminology, another interesting question, which I know, Eline, you've actually commented on this question already. And the question's around, you know, what have we learned regarding terminology? Is returnables more popular, clearer than reusables? And what drives action in terms of terminology? So, Eline, do you want to comment on that first?
Yeah, so what we mainly learned actually that reuse also has this more negative perspective from hygiene, that like reuse and how you know it's handled properly, how do you guarantee that? Whereas if it's returnables, then you already stress the fact that it's returned, and then there's this whole process in the back of the whole reuse system that makes sure it's safe and clean. And so from a hygiene point of view, returnables are preferred, we learned.
Rosie, any thoughts on that from you in terms of terminology that you find that works best?
Yeah, I think with reusable as well, and specifically on cups, a lot of people see reusables as sort of a personal reusable cup. So something like returnable, like Eline was saying, does sort of gets across that you're meant to return it and hint at that system. I personally do feel like the word returnable feels a bit clunky, or it's just not I feel like it's a bit of a new word. It's probably not that common in people's language, but it is, I think, the best fitting word at the moment. So that's what we're going to be leading with the CUP scheme in Glasgow, and testing, how much that resonates with people. But having that clear focus on return, that's the main thing we want people to do. It seems like the best way forward.
Jolanda, any thoughts on terminology?
Yeah, I think we have been following the Ellen MacArthur let's say models, where you would say you have your refill models, you have your return models, and then all of this is, let's say, your reuse models, but you can then distinguish between reusable refill models and reusable return models. But yeah, that's indeed, I think it is important to get this clear and to understand what we are talking about. But yeah, that's how we approach it.
Okay, question on distributed consumer engagement. Do you publish, this is really a question for Jolanda, I think, do you publish life cycle analysis type data for consumers so they can see the benefits, you know, the environmental benefits, the lessening impact benefits of participating in using reuse and refill models?
We don't publish these because it's very like the whole life cycle analysis is very dependent on, let's say, the return rate, for example. But there are different factors in terms of how this life cycle analysis would perform compared to, for example, recycling. We do it for every innovation project that we do. So if we have a new innovation, we would do a life cycle analysis to understand what is, how does this compare to the existing product that we're selling on the market. Sometimes that means you have to make trade-offs between, is this carbon savings or would this, for example, reduce plastic waste? But yeah, it's not something we would publish, but it's something that we would do for every innovation project that we launch.
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, I guess a lot of this is around how do you get the incentive right to encourage consumers to do this. I think, and just in closing, very briefly, if you could all just give us some idea on how you get that bit right, because it strikes me that's the kind of the core of getting this done. So Rosie.
Yeah, I think to get consumers on board, it's twofold. I think the cost element, it not costing any more, and ideally there being a discount, and communicating the environmental benefit, because I think we can't just presume that people know that reuse or refill is better than recycling. There has been so much education and focus on recycling, at least in the UK, that we need to really explain that environmental benefit and make it tangible. And one stat that we got was that over 50% of people would be happy to still use a reuse or refill system, even if it was less convenient, if they knew that there was environmental or money-saving benefits to be had. So I think while convenience is so important, people will go slightly like one step out of their way to do something if they know it's either saving them money or it's good for the environment and it's a good thing to do.
Great. And I can promise, as a native Glaswegian, I will use your scheme in Glasgow when I'm there over the coming months. Thank you. Eline, same question to you. I mean, how do you, if you're pitching the incentive, how do you get that right?
Yeah, so yeah, obviously the pricing part, right, we already discussed, but I think the convenience of the system is also super important. So yeah, we just say life is better with reuse, and just make it very easy. There's so many options consumers can choose, like they can order via WhatsApp, they can order via e-commerce, they can go to these small stores. So just really be present in all these different channels, so you link to all the different consumer needs. And to get new consumers, we also are focusing on creating these events, because usually in an event it's easier to get consumers to directly use it if that is the system. If there's just only reusable cups and that's the only option, then you get consumers to try it and then experience like, oh hey, it's actually not that hard, I just return it here and then I'm done.
Okay, thank you. And Jolanda, final thoughts to you. Same question.
Yeah, I can only just echo what Rosie and what Eline were already saying. It's about cost, it's about convenience, and I think it's also like ensuring that it is available in stores, so that consumers, it's easy for them to find it, and that they don't have to go like a long way to. But that again links to the convenience. And I think also, I think what Rosie also already mentioned is that making it desirable. So I think the education piece is also very important, that consumers understand what this actually is and what they are doing, and making it desirable, let's say, to consumers to do it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. I'm going to have to draw the discussion to a close as we are running out of time. Many thanks to our panel. It's been a really interesting conversation, so thank you so much to all of you. And what we've been talking today will be on the agenda at the Sustainable Packaging Innovation Forum USA in Philadelphia on the 29th and 30th of October. And now is a great time to secure your place at the conference, as there's a special $300 discount on 2-day passes this week. If you want to come with colleagues, we can offer group discounts. So there's also some sponsorship opportunities available as well. Full details on the Innovation Forum website. And in fact, you'll be redirected there to the conference landing page in a second. Now, we want to make sure that we're developing useful content and discussion. So please do fill in the feedback form that you'll receive on email. And we'll be in touch in the next couple of days to share audio and video recordings of the webinar, so you can watch or listen again at your leisure and share with your colleagues. For now, I hope you found the webinar useful. I've been Ian Welsh, and thank you for joining us. Goodbye.